Good morning. It is great to be in Martinsburg. It's Missy's and my first time to be here, and what a beautiful place it is. We enjoyed getting to go to Gettysburg yesterday and ate some great pizza and saw the beautiful sights there and the history in that part, and appreciate so much your hospitality, the hospitality of the elders and their wives, and your ministers and their wives, and appreciate being with you this morning. I wasn't expecting to see Tristan Facello and Katie here. I mean, I feel like I'm back in Henderson, but I have a lot of love for Tristan, former student of mine, and appreciate the work that he does at Fraser Hardeman too, and actually helped out this summer with a program we were doing, the Equip Camp, and so thanks, Tristan. Great you made it back from the Outer Banks. Glad you're here with your family. There in the back is my wife, and if you were here yesterday, you met Missy. Missy, raise your hand. That's my wife back there, and she's the one that she told me a few years ago. She said, Ryan, if you're speaking too long, if you're preaching too long, my sign is this. She does this. And that's when I go, and in conclusion, immediately. So sometimes it's like she's giving mixed symbol signs. I'm not sure if she's just scratching her neck, and I get a little uncomfortable, unsure whether to quit, but I'm going to be watching the clock, and I've got the clock back there. Loss is hard. Losing someone or something that you love and depend on is difficult. The end of my freshman year at Fraser Hardeman, the last week of school, I went out to a state park called Chickasaw State Park. I was about 18 years old at the time, and played a tennis match with a good friend. He was about a junior at Fraser Hardeman. We played tennis. It was a beautiful day, and probably the second last day of school. I probably should have been studying for my finals, but I wasn't. But I was out there playing tennis. Got back to Nashville. I would spend the summers in Nashville. I'm from South Africa, but I couldn't hardly fly back and forth to South Africa. So my older brother and I would stay in Nashville with friends through the summer and I'd work. And it was the end of about the second week of the summer. So summer just started, and in Nashville, my brother says, "Hey, Ryan, I need to talk to you." I was like, okay. And so he pulls me aside. I remember where we were, outside there in a nice place in Nashville, at a person's house. And he says, Ryan, your friend, that guy that you played tennis with, just yesterday, he went to a quick stop, and I don't know what happened, but he got shot. And he's dead. He died. And I remember just being in absolute shock. I couldn't believe it. It just literally just been days before. We'd been playing tennis and goofing around and doing what college students do, and now he is gone. He's dead. And sometimes all of us have been through situations probably similar to that, maybe not through a violent death, but things that happen. Even when we're expecting something to happen, it doesn't make it any easier, right? Even when we're anticipating someone that's going to pass away, we call that anticipatory grief. When you're anticipating it, maybe you think you're getting prepared for it, but the interesting thing is that even after the loss takes place, there's still an onslaught of grief. It's still challenging. And grief and loss come in lots of different forms, and so we'll touch on that. But I'm glad we can delve into this topic this morning. And I realize that in a group this size, here in October, that there's no doubt people sitting here I'm confident that people sitting here this morning that have recently gone through losses. It might have been the loss of a loved one. It might have been the loss of a job. It might have been the loss of health. It might have been the loss of a relationship. It might have been the loss of a family pet. Family pets are part of the family. Our dog Penelope, that was 18 years old when she passed away a couple of years ago. And that's hard. That's hard, right? And so we deal with these different forms of losses. And as we grieve, nothing can really prepare us. Nothing can really prepare us for the death of a loved one. Even if we know they're terminal, there's just something about them not being physically present in this world, whether or not they struggle with Alzheimer's or dementia or some other issue. Just the fact that they're no longer here is difficult. It's difficult to cope with. And I think about Paul's approach, and take your Bibles and open up to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I do have it on the screen, but I'll just prefer to read this. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, in other words, those who have passed on, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Look in verse 14. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with them those who have fallen asleep. So Paul is offering hope, and he is doing some theologizing as well about the end of time, and just talking about the second coming of the Lord. But talking to the church in Thessalonica, where there were some misnomers, and people were struggling with loss, and they weren't sure how a Christian is supposed to respond. And I want you to notice that he doesn't say we don't grieve. He doesn't say we do not grieve. He just says we don't grieve without hope. We still grieve. To be human is to suffer loss. To be human is to struggle with sadness. To be human at times is to be in inexplicable, excruciating emotional pain at loss, especially the loss of those that we love. And something else I want to debunk as we start out, because there's a lot of misunderstandings on this. And when I teach my counseling courses, I've taught grief counseling and crisis counseling, people think about, and they talk about the stages of grief, right? The 5 stages of grief. And where they get that from, and in popular psychology, they come up with these stages from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. So this is a classic book from the 60s, and talks about these 5 stages. The problem is, with those 5 so-called stages of grief, those are not stages of grief. They're not stages of grief. They're stages of dying. It's a different dynamic, right? And so people follow through, especially when they get to about the 4th stage or so, that is bargaining. And they don't understand, well, how does this fit into grief? Well, it's not about grief. It's like Hezekiah, who bargained with God for more years, right, on this earth. And so it doesn't fit exactly. When I've had counselees coming in that are dealing with grief and mourning the loss of someone or something, and they say, Dr. Fraser, I feel like I'm not grieving properly because I'm not going through the proper stages. And I've got to normalize their experience and say, first of all, everyone grieves differently. Second of all, those stages are not applicable to grieving. You've got to really make it stretch to fit. And the other thing is that grief doesn't happen in a linear fashion. It's cyclical. It comes and goes. You think you're doing well, and all of a sudden you are bowled over by just a torrent of waves and sadness that hit you out of the blue, right, when you're least expected. And it comes and goes. And a lot of people will say, well, how long is the grieving process? How long am I going to be feeling these feelings? And my response is, well, it depends. It depends on how close you were to that person or that thing that you've lost, how significant it was, and were there any complicated things? Was there trauma involved in this? You might have lost a parent or a child 10, 15 years ago and you're still grieving. And I'm sorry. But that's the reality, right? It's not something we just forget about. And though we learn to manage, and there's a new normal that comes, but it doesn't go in an orderly time frame. And we like to fit things in boxes. Good luck in grief, because it doesn't fit in a box. Everyone experiences it in a different way. And so culture, especially North American culture, tells us to move on so fast in grief. And by the way, I don't even do grief counseling in the first 3 months. If somebody's lost a loved one and they're like 2 or 3 weeks in and they say, hey, we want to come for grief counseling, I'll say, well, we need to wait about 3 months. And they're like, why? I say, because you don't even know what you've lost yet. You can't even appreciate what you've lost yet. They're still in a state of in a state of shock or surreal still. Now I'll do some crisis counseling on the front end, but really working with mourning and good mourning with clients, that takes a while, and it's not going to happen right away. When I've run grief groups at hospitals and worked with those that have lost children and such like, the first couple of weeks they're just barely surviving. And I tell people, when you've lost something so near and dear to your heart, your job right now is to survive. Just get through it the best way you can until you can see straight again and be able to work through it. And in our culture, we expect people to get to work, back to work, and just move on. The world moves on, and maybe you're in this situation. The world moves on, and you feel like you're left behind, and everyone's moved on after the funeral, and here you are stuck, and maybe you don't even feel able to talk about it because it makes people uncomfortable. The church needs to be a place where grieving can happen in a healthy way, and I appreciate African cultures. I was raised again in South Africa, and Eastern cultures and Middle Eastern cultures where people will wear a veil for over a year. Just to be given the benefit of the doubt and given a break and realize, hey, this is gonna take time. But grieving is a process. God gave us the capacity to grieve. He wired us psychologically and spiritually so we can go through these dynamics and bring us back to a place of wholeness. Another way to say this is, and a former chaplain supervisor of mine, I worked at a hospital for a while in north of Burleson, Texas, so Fort Worth, Hughley Memorial Medical Center. And I was trained as a chaplain there, and my supervisor, Dr. Lyndall Anderson, he said, grieving is about getting yourself back. It's like, think about that. It's not about getting the person back. It's about getting yourself back. Trying to figure out, who am I without this person or this thing or this ability in my life? And so God tries to bring us back to a wholeness. So what does Scripture say about grief? Let's walk through some of this. Psalm 34, verse 18, and I shared this yesterday. It's on one of the bracelets that Missy's got back there. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So God is with us when we grieve. God is with us when we are crushed. God is with us when we are in the fetal position, right, because of pain. He is there when we're crushed in spirit. It might feel like God is a million miles away, but that doesn't make it so. Think about on the cross. What did Jesus say on the cross? Well, he said 7 different things, but one of the things he said was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why in the world did Jesus say that? Had God really forsaken him? Well, in his human state, Jesus felt like his Father had forsaken him. But what is he doing? Jesus is quoting Psalm 22. That's a Davidic psalm, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? In fact, it's a lament psalm. Lament psalms always start low and end up on the lily pad of acceptance of our situation and on the lily pad of praising God. Psalm 22 does the same. It follows this path, this downward path, and then it comes up again at the end of the psalm. So Jesus experienced, as a human being in his human form, he experienced what it feels like to have your Heavenly Father abandon you. That's what it felt like. But God was still there. God was still there. God doesn't abandon us in our suffering. Though we know the sins of the world were put on Jesus at that time, and so in a manner of speaking, there was this incredible, excruciating, comes from the word for cross, it's excruciating emotional pain that Jesus was experiencing as sin, in a manner of speaking, separated him from his Father, just as sin separates us from God. But that doesn't mean that God's not there, right? Remember, God's omnipresent. God is everywhere. And so Psalm 56 verse 8 says, you have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? That's one of the most beautiful scriptures. That God, it's like he keeps a little bottle with our tears. And he keeps count of our tears, just like he keeps count of the hairs on our head. And he's written, he knows what we're going through. He appreciates that God, through Jesus, experienced loss as well. And so Jesus has been through everything we've gone through except without sin. Psalm 145 verse 14, the Lord upholds all who are falling and raises up all who are bowed down. And so in our darkest hour, in our most painful moment, God is there upholding us. God is there bringing us strength. Isaiah 53, Messianic Psalm. This was the one that the Ethiopian eunuch was reading on the road to Gaza when Philip, the evangelist, came up and said, do you know what you're reading? Is the prophet speaking about him or somebody else? And Philip preached Jesus to him on the chariot, starting in this text. But it's Isaiah 53. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Who's that speaking about? Jesus. Jesus knows when we're hurting. He understands, not theoretically understands, not understands from a distance. He understands firsthand what this experience is. And we know, of course, that Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And so what's interesting there in that story is that's at the time of Lazarus. Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. Jesus delays his coming to Bethany with his disciples. Mary and Martha are there, and they are the siblings of Lazarus, and they are besides themselves and really upset that Jesus didn't make it sooner. And okay, let me ask you, did Jesus know he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Was that an afterthought? What do y'all think? Of course, he knew what he was going to do. He knew what he was going to do. So why did he weep? Any ideas? Why would Jesus weep? He knew he was about to raise him. One of the greatest miracles he did. I'm sorry? Empathy. Connection. He's connecting to the pain. All the people mourning, all the family and friends around. He's connecting to their pain, right? Now, oh man, in the counseling profession, there's a belief out there, and I'm just going to debunk this belief because it's garbage, all right? But the belief is that therapists like myself or people that are working in hospital settings, that you empathize with your patients. So you learn to, put yourself in these shoes. You empathize with them, but don't sympathize with them. Because sympathizing is to pity them. What? I'm going to feel some of the pain that my clients feel. Some of the most powerful moments I have in my office with clients is when they see my eyes well up with tears when they tell me their story. Because we connect at a human level, and Jesus is described in the Hebrews as being a sympathizing high priest. A sympathizing high priest who feels along with us. Doesn't just feel for us, he feels along with us. And so, I don't know how you can really empathize with somebody if you can't sympathize with them as well. And that's, I think the problem in the counseling field is that word's been taken and redefined to mean something it doesn't mean. This has to do with the concept of being moved with compassion. Jesus was moved with compassion. Really cool word in Greek, splagnizomai in Greek, splagnizomai. Everyone, no, never mind, don't say that. Splagnizomai comes from the Greek splagnon. Splagnon, talk about the bowels, because that's where, in the Jewish mind, that's where you feel things. We still feel things in our gut, right? We talk more about the heart here in our culture, but they feel it in the bowels. He was moved. He was moved to compassion, right? And so we're moved, and Jesus is moved. And when we're trying to help somebody who is hurting, I remember showing up at a lady's house one day, Sunday morning. She called me like 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning. Her name is Ruby Treadwell. Ruby's husband, and I baptized her husband in his older years. She calls me. She was a wonderful Texas lady. She just calls me, says, my husband passed away this morning. So I show up at her house, knock on the door. She opens the door. We stood there in silence for about 5-10 minutes. What do you say? What do you say? Right? I can't say something to make her feel better. I just need to be present. It's a ministry of presence. It's an incarnational ministry, and that's what Jesus did. Jesus cared enough to show up in person. He came in person, right? He didn't send us a telegram. He didn't send us a text message, one email. He showed up to show his love, and we show up and show our love to those who suffer loss. So loss is an inevitable part of life. Grief is a natural part of the healing process. We've got to go through grief. Some people try to medicate themselves around grief, and I'm a proponent of medication in the right circumstances, so let me clarify that. But you can only medicate yourself so much. The problem with grief is, after you've numbed yourself for a while, the grief's still going to be waiting there for you. It's going to be there, and you're going to have to walk through it. There's no way over it. There's no way around it. You've got to walk through it eventually. Now, sometimes in the process, we need a little help just to get our feet back under us, but it's a natural part of this healing thing. So it's different types of major losses, so let's kind of walk through a few of these. Subtle or less obvious losses, so the loss of a pet, the loss of a job, the loss of our house, that burns to the ground, or the loss of a friendship. That's a loss. Divorce feels like a death, except for the person is still alive, right? That is dead to you now. And it's tough. So those are subtle. Sudden versus predictable losses. So Missy and I were traveling a few years ago with our family in the summer, and I get this call. The call a minister Bob never wants to get, right? The call is one of the young ladies in the congregation is driving her vehicle. She's got her child and her niece in the back seat, little people, 5, 7 years old. Drunk driver, well, it wasn't a drunk driver, it was actually a young man changing the radio station, I think. Swerves, head-on collision. 2 little girls die. And so I'm called to fly back home from vacation just to be with the family, right? Sudden, shocking, just unimaginable. And what made matters worse is, and I got this right, that the woman driving was the grandmother who was driving. She was unconscious. She was in a coma for a while. She didn't even make it to the funeral, right? So when she comes out of the coma, she finds out that her grandchildren died in that car. And so that's just so unpredictable, it's so sudden, it's so unexpected and brutal to get through, right? By the way, you go to a funeral when somebody's lost little kids like that, do not say this. Do not say this. Well, the Lord must have needed them more than you did. Do not say this. It must have just been their time. No. That is bad theology. We live in an open universe. Good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people. The writer of Ecclesiastes says time and chance happens to everybody. Time and chance. That's part of living in an open universe. Right? We're not robots. And so unpredictable things. Now, God didn't make it happen. It's not God's fault. Sometimes the devil makes things happen. Remember Job? The devil killed off his kids, right? God gets credit for things that Satan does in a fallen world. But those unpredictable losses. The presence of grief is unavoidable, it's untamable, and it's unpredictable. The presence of grief is unavoidable. You can't tame it, you can't smooth it out, and you can't predict what it will do and how it will impact people. A few years ago, I had a lady come to counseling, and she was dealing with complicated or complex grief. She was having panic attacks in her grief. She'd never suffered from anxiety or panic attacks before, but the reason why she's suffering now from panic attacks is 2 years before, her son had passed away in a boating accident, and then less than a year later, her daughter passed away in a car accident. Talk about pulling the rug out. Right? She just felt, she felt like she's free falling through space, right? And she was divorced, a single mom. So her world just crashing down, right? And no wonder. I think if I was in her shoes, I would have been going through panic attacks. We had to just deal with that and process. It was a long process. The power of grief. The power of grief reminds us of our finitude, that we are human, that this life is not forever. The power of grief resigns us to our trust in God. I'm not in control. If you think you're in control, good luck. You're not in control. God is in control. We try to control things in our environment, but things still happen, right? To the most careful people, the most healthy people still have heart attacks and die. Right? So it resigns us to that, and it refines us. It refines us. It causes us to grow. We grow through our grief. We hopefully become better people, stronger people, wiser people, more compassionate people because of our own experience. The process of grief, remember I told you it's not linear. It's cyclical. Dynamics come and go, and there's many, many different dynamics. Shock, anger, sometimes relief, depending on the relationship, shame, guilt, fear, sometimes hallucinations happen. That is not uncommon, where people say, hey, I heard my spouse's voice. I saw my spouse. I've heard that so many times. Whoops, I heard my child speaking to me. I don't know what happens in the spiritual world, right? But that's not an uncommon experience. Doesn't mean that you're losing your mind. Sometimes people say, am I losing my mind? Say, no, you're not losing your mind. You're experiencing what lots of other people have gone through. And so it's dynamic, and there's some normal grief reactions that we can kind of expect. But everyone experiences it differently, though, right? So again, what did I say? What's your job when you're going through grief? to survive, to get through it the best way you can. Don't turn to drugs and alcohol or other things that are unhealthy. I've known of young women, and this is, again, I've just seen this time and again, a young woman, maybe 20, 21 years old, married, loses their mother unexpectedly. And the young woman ends up acting out sexually, has an affair, though ordinarily that would never happen, right? But they step out on their husband that they've just married within the last year or two. And why do they do that? Well, they're trying to feel alive. They feel so dead inside. They're just trying to get through it. It's so unhealthy, and it causes all sorts of other problems, of course. But that's an abnormal type of response, right? An unhealthy response. And so I like this grief wheel. And so you're going along, you're rocking along, life is going as normal, and life functioning is good, and all of a sudden you suffer a loss, either predictable or unpredictable loss. And so one of the dynamics that comes and goes, but this is the one thing that if you use Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, really 5 stages of dying, she does speak about shock, which dying people go through that too. So experience this shock, this just being surprised by it. Next is a process of protest where you may be angry at yourself, angry at the person who died, angry at God, right? I'm thankful that God's shoulders are big enough to handle our anger. And God wants us to be real with Him. And so this is protest. And then there's this period of disorganization where everything's a shambles. You can't think straight. That is why people are told in the first year after a major loss, don't make any major decisions. Don't sell your house or move on or get remarried or have another child right away, or, just take your time to let things settle back in, all right? So this period of disorganization, and people often will make some pretty foolish decisions in the 6 or 12 months after a loss, because they're just not thinking clearly yet. Then there's a period of reorganization. Is life ever going to be the same again? No. Is it going to be good? Can it be good? Yes, it can be good, but it's going to be different. You're going to learn who you are without this person, without this ability, or without your childhood home that's burned to the ground. Right? So you go through that reorganization and then move on from there. Here's a rule of thumb, y'all. Now, I'm talking very loosely here on this, but with the loss of a loved one, I normally tell people it takes about a couple of years. It takes a couple of years. The first year, every birthday, every holiday, it just feels like it sets you back to ground one again, just with that grief. You go through the first year cycle and everything's tough. The second year cycle is still difficult, but you start maybe making some new traditions in your family and fitting into some new roles in your family, right? And so you get through that second year, and I'm not going to say it's easy beyond that, but it's more manageable, right? You can function more normally. William Worden, in his book on grief, talks about 4 tasks of grieving, so the purpose of grieving. Number 1, your task is to accept the reality of the loss. Reality is your friend. Accept the reality. Number 2, work through the pain and the grief. Work through it, maybe with a counselor, maybe in a support group. Some of it might be individual, reading books. There's a really good book that this guy wrote called, I believe it's called Good Grief. Really good. Adjust to a new environment without the person or thing that you've lost. And then find an enduring connection with the deceased while moving forward. And so you still honor their life. Maybe at Thanksgiving you put a candle at their seat, you keep a seat for them at the table, but you move forward, right? So 4 tasks in the purpose of grief. The promise of grief. Over time, this raw, seemingly intolerable pain of grief subsides. And there's a unique opportunity to grow. There's a unique opportunity to help others that have gone through loss, to come alongside of them and say, hey, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but this is my story. And maybe you can relate a little bit to what I went through. And so you learn to cope, and you learn to serve, and you learn to help. How to cope with grief. How to cope with grief. I've got 6 minutes, so I'm going to walk through it. Give yourself permission to grieve. I always tell my counselees, you've got to grieve in the way you grieve. It's not going to look the same way for other people in your family. You grieve the way you grieve. I give them permission. Be patient. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with others in this process. Accept yourself. Accept where you are right now. You don't have to paste on a fake smile. You might not feel like going out with the family or your friends. You might just want to stay at home and watch a sad movie. That's fine. Accept where you are. Express your feelings. It's okay to cry. Tears are a gift. A lot of men in my office will apologize when they cry. And I just say, tears are a gift. It's okay to cry. I'll get the mop and the bucket afterwards, and we'll just kind of clean it out, right? Tears are good. Seek emotional support. You don't need to do this by yourself. We're not intended to grieve alone. God didn't make us that way. And try to maintain your basic lifestyle. Try to keep a routine. If you walk, I was speaking with a young man who's a minister recently who lost his mother to cancer. He's a runner. I make sure I check in and say, are you still running? How far have you run? How's things going with your wife and your baby? And just checking in with them, but trying to maintain that basic lifestyle. Take care of yourself. Avoid overindulgence. Don't try to eat your feelings, right? Or numb them with alcohol. Forgive yourself if you feel like maybe there were some things you could have done differently. Give yourself a break from grief. It's okay to take a little mini vacation. Go see a movie. The grief will be waiting on you afterwards when you go back home. Take a little mini vacation. Come back to it later. Don't feel guilty for that. Grieving is exhausting work. Prepare for holidays and anniversaries. You may want to meet with a big family. Maybe you don't, though. Maybe you want to just do a more simple holiday. Join a bereavement support group. That's a great opportunity. Great opportunity. So just some practical things. One of my favorite Psalms that I read with folks who have lost their loved ones, so this is one of my absolute favorites, Psalm 46, 1-3. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. God's there. And then Revelation, as we wrap things up. Revelation 21. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So there's not such a thing as heaven on earth, but one day in heaven we know that there will be no more grief. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, Jesus said. I've enjoyed talking with you this morning. Any comments? Anyone have a thought, maybe something you found helpful in this presentation, or something that you found helpful outside of this presentation in your own grief and struggles? Yes, sir.
I was just thinking of the value of memory. Bill's been gone several years, but every once in a while something will trigger a scene from the past. And those memories you can just live it over again in your mind.
Yeah. Reminiscence, memory is powerful and comforting, helpful. Good. Thank you. That's great. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I think Christ also took an opportunity to glorify his Father for his grief.
Yeah.
Magnify him. That's why he allowed that as God, because he knew that that would be
Excellent point. Excellent point. Jesus glorified his Father through his grief, and we can glorify our Heavenly Father through the way we grieve. Not without hope and faith, but we still grieve, right? But we can bring glory to God in the way we handle it. Very good. I love it. Anyone else? All right. We're going to call it quits. Never say that I never let you out early. All right. We're about a minute early.